Greetings, everybody, and welcome. Starting slightly earlier today, we are coming to you with an anniversary show, looking at the events of 23 years ago, which of course means September the 11th, 2001, and what that has come to mean across the world. We're also going to be taking in, of course, the earlier September the 11th of 1973, almost, 51 years ago now, and bringing it right up to date with a look at the recent propaganda job done by my close personal friends over at Norovirus Media, where they gave a welcome platform, an uncritical platform, to a certain Anne Applebaum, or as she's more better known, a Mrs. Radek Sikorski recently. And it is to that we will be turning first, because, of course, it happened quite recently, and I was asked to respond to this. Now, I won't be going through the whole hour-long video because it's too tedious and has nothing of real value in it. I would say, though, that the fact that Aaron Bastani, the cretin that and con man who runs Norovirus Media, allowed such a egregious piece of propaganda from a proven liar and propagandist of the lowest kind on his supposedly leftist platform just shows you what Norovirus Media are all about, meaning that if you contract a case of Novara Media, you will be literally full of shit and will be spraying it everywhere. So why does Applebaum feel at home on Novara Media? Because Norovirus Media, as I will now call them in perpetuity, have been, from the very beginning, a pro-imperialist operation. Social democracies, social democrats in imperialist countries are always imperialist, even if they hide behind pacifism, even if they hide behind various strains of defense of international law or anything like that. Bastani comes out of a particular trajectory. He was an advisor to David Miliband. Now, David Miliband, if you're not familiar with him, is, I would say, a long-term American intelligence asset. He was foreign secretary at the time that the CIA and other American intelligence services were running torture flights through Britain with his full connivance, and he was rewarded for his services to American imperialism by being given a job in charge of an American intelligence front organization known as International Rescue. And you can check his biog on Wikipedia. It's all on there. International Rescue used to be an acknowledged CIA front, but they say it's not anymore, which of course means that it is. So that's who Aaron Bastani got his political start with, working for a man who is, at the very least, a former, if not current, CIA asset. He then gets himself all over the press, running around the student occupations and actions of 2010, and then going around with UK Uncut. He then starts Norovirus Media with several other chancers who later attached themselves to the Corbyn movement. Somehow he picks up a following. Now, I would argue that if you manage to pick up the following that he's done on YouTube, it means that you have never been suppressed by YouTube. And if you've never been suppressed by YouTube, it's because those who are in charge actually don't mind your message being out there. In fact, they quite like your message. Now, as far as I know, and I'm prepared to be corrected on this, Norovirus Media has never been actively suppressed or shadow banned by YouTube or any of the other social media companies, as far as I know. If you know differently, then I will gladly correct myself. But as far as I know, they've never been suppressed. They've never been shadow banned. They've never been subject to any of the banning operations or restrictions that myriad other YouTube channels over the last 10 years have been restricted to, especially over the last 5 years. And you get to the point when you understand who's really in charge of social media, and it's largely people who are connected directly to the Western, i.e. British and American intelligence services, then you have to ask the question, well, why is norovirus media allowed to spray its shit everywhere? The answer is because, of course, they're aligned completely with the key priorities of British imperialism. Yes, norovirus media utters some objections to the actions of the Israeli regime. That's actually not too far out of line with what certain elements within the British ruling class think. That's why you're allowed to do that, as long as you don't connect it to, as norovirus media don't, British imperialism, the role of British imperialism in West Asia, the role of American imperialism in West Asia, the role of Israel as a direct agent of American imperialism. As long as you don't do any of that, as long as you maintain your coverage to be along the lines of inconsequential hand-wringing, whilst, as Aaron Bastani does, making apologetics for Zionism, then again you're allowed to continue on your way. And the reason why you're allowed to do all of this is because the British ruling class, ever since the October Revolution over 100 years ago, have seen the need and the value of what has been called a compatible, or I would call an in-house left. And norovirus media are an in-house left, just as the Labour Party left is, just as most of the trade union left is. And now you don't want this in-house left actually having any power. If you're the ruling class, you don't want that. But what you do want to make sure is that if people are starting to wake up to certain realities, that you push them towards the in-house left, who will mislead them, who will lie to them about the possibilities of change and how it could be achieved in Britain, and the real nature of imperialism overseas. And they will back up imperialism on key things, such as the Ukraine war, such as the Syrian war 10 years ago, such as the general attitude towards Russia and China. All of those things, Aaron Bastani and norovirus media will back up the main points the ruling class wants to sell to people, which is why they can have Anne Applebaum on, who's written a series of ludicrous propaganda books about the Soviet Union and about Russia, and they can find much to agree on, because they do agree on much. And Aaron Bastani's real project of social democracy reborn, if that is indeed his real project, is only possible if, of course, British imperialism gets a new shot in the arm via the dismembering of Russia and or China. So this is a meeting of minds, not very large minds, but a meeting of minds nonetheless. And it is here that you will see ex-hipster Aaron Bastani get down with the arch American imperialist propagandist's point of view. Like I said, we're not going to go through all of this because it's too painful and tedious to go through. But the parts about Russia, I think are worth looking at. So I'm just going to jump in where she's talking about Putin and Russia. It's only still quite long. So we're going to go through some of this and talk about it. So bear with me. And I promise there will be a reward at the end of this particular hard slog. So let's share this. You should all be able to see Aaron Bastani wearing his thinking face there. That proves he's thinking very hard about what lie to tell next. So this is a section entitled Putin and Russia. So let's get underway.
On Putin's anti-liberalism in particular, I mean, that is a very sort of incontrovertible, quite conspicuous part of his politics. But it wasn't always thus. You know, in the early 21st century, he was viewed as effectively a liberal helmsman.
Just bear with me a second. I might have to do this from a video file.
I know how Putin came to power, and the reason that I know what our role was, our broadly meaning us Western democratic societies, is that the Russian opposition explained it to me. So they followed this for many years. That they would say, well, you people, you talk about human rights. why do you let Russian oligarchs hide their money in London? Why do you let them buy property using anonymous companies and shell companies? Why have you created these tax havens that they can steal?
Right, we're going to have to stop straight away there because, and it's not just because I can't stand her voice or Aaron Bastani's face, it's because she's already lying. What she's going to do throughout all of this is to try and locate Putin with, or as I should say, a servant of the Russian oligarch class. Now, she's going to do this over and over again, so I might as well get my counterpoint in straight away. The reason why Russian oligarchs can buy large amounts of property in London and elsewhere, and the reason why they can funnel their money around the place, was because it was in the interests of British imperialism to do so. That's the reason why. If you look at why they were allowed to buy so much property in London and New York, it's because the British and American imperialists saw it as being in their interests to have a situation where it was easy for these comprador elements in Russia to drain Russia of money. And of course, Putin, if you can criticize him for anything, and indeed you can, it's that he didn't place any restrictions on this for a long time. And he did that because he'd made a deal with the oligarchy over 20 years ago now, whereby they agreed essentially to stay out of the level of political activity they've been engaged in the 90s. In return, they will be allowed to keep their money. And he's stuck by that, and they've continued to move their money to Cyprus and through Cyprus to various tax havens. And if Applebaum's going to criticize tax havens, well, both the British and the American imperialist systems have tax havens as a crucial part of their operations. And again, the reason why you allow the Russian oligarchy to do that is to bind it ever closer to the imperialist point of view. And as for the Russian opposition, that as Applebaum describes it, the actual Russian opposition is the Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Now, she will never mention them all the way through this interview. And none of the people, the propagandists of this ilk, will mention them. They will insist that Alexei Navalny, a man who I'm sure most Russians had never heard of, was the main Russian opposition leader. Of course, he wasn't. And the distinction that she seems to draw between, or the conflation, I should say, that she's making between Putin and the oligarchs, again, just simply isn't true. You can accuse Putin of a lot, and in fact, you can accuse him of being going far too easy on the oligarchy for the purposes of maintaining stability as he sees it. But the way she's going to go on to describe Putin is simply inaccurate. Describing him as somehow being the arch defender of the oligarchy, or a man who has enriched himself at the expense of the Russian population. Again, I don't think that's necessarily true in terms of the role that Putin has played. So I'm going to just go on and look at another couple of things here. I'm going to skip forward so I can spare you the whole horror of this. So now we're going to go into the section where she's dealing with what she said terms of Putin and Russia. So be prepared for me to pause this a lot.
Back.
Mm. On Putin's anti-liberalism in particular, I mean, that is a very sort of incontrovertible, quite conspicuous part of his politics. But it wasn't always thus. You know, in the early 21st century, he was viewed as effectively a liberal helmsman for post-Yeltsin, post-transition Russia.
Right. So I never thought that.
I know you didn't think. Well, that's the question. Is so how deep does the anti-liberalism for somebody like Putin go? Because I would look at Putin as really a reactionary political figure in so much as he believes in pre-liberal political ideas. You're just saying it's actually about expediency and self-interest. And if tomorrow he needs to say something else to maximize his interests, he would.
Well, I got to pause there because I mean everything Bastani just said there is complete and utter drivel. I will maintain my point of view, and that is actually based on research, not some shit that Aaron Bastani read from, I don't know, a badly photocopied Christopher Hitchens piece for Vanity Fair 15 years ago. I will maintain that Putin is indeed a liberal in the real sense of the term. That Putin is a pro-capitalist. He's not as much of an anti-communist as he was 20 years ago, but it's still there. He has clamped down upon the Russian oligarchy in order to stabilize the Russian state. He has instituted a number of pro-capitalist reforms throughout his period in office. He's made a left turn recently, only out of necessity, not out of an ideological conviction, shall we say. He has instituted reforms inside Russia that I would describe as very pro-capitalist. So Putin is a liberal with Russian characteristics. Now, in terms of Putin's anti-liberalism, I think if you actually got Aaron Bastani to answer a question on this, he would probably say something about LGBTQ stuff or various other things. But in actual terms of content, Putin's anti-liberalism comes down to the fact that in reality he is what I would call a Russian national liberal, meaning that he runs a regime which is, I would say, a form of progressive Bonapartism, progressive in the sense that it has restored to a large degree Russian sovereignty and independence bit by bit over a long period of time. And this is why people like Applebaum hate him so much. And Bastani's just not bothered with any of that. I mean, he has, to be fair to him, he's at least consistent in his wrongness, in that he's said shit like this as long as I can remember. And I remember him 14 years ago saying similar things. And this is like, this is the standard line that not just like Soc Dems take, but Trotskyites take in Britain as well. But let's hear Applebaum's answer.
I mean, I think, people can have more than one idea or more than one motivation. I mean, I think Putin is motivated simultaneously by some weird mystical thing about recreating the Russian Empire. I think that.
You hear all that? Weird and mystical. I'll let her full answer play before we come in to critique it.
That's true. I think he's very profoundly motivated by the desire to stay in power indefinitely. I think he's motivated by the desire to keep his money wherever it is and for the people around him to keep their money. And I think he's motivated by profound resentment of the democratic world that robbed him of his career as a KGB officer. So, all those things add up. I mean, I do think that from the 90s, he was somebody who never accepted or believed in certainly liberal politics. I mean, he went along for a long time with the idea that Russia could trade with the West and that would be okay and there could be some degree of integration. But really, from the moment he had power in Russia, the very, very first things he did was begin to shut down the media, recontrol civil society, create fake political parties, and so on. I mean, he had an illiberal agenda from the early 2000s. It's just that we chose not to notice it.
Right. Okay. So a lot of what she just said is utter horse manure. Aaron Bastani is now wearing his in deep concentration face. So I'm just going to carry on and say the ideas that she just put out there were a bunch of utterly contradictory rubbish. First of all, let's deal with the idea that Putin is about getting rich and protecting his riches. Now, if Putin was indeed about that, if he was indeed about cashing in and making as much money as possible, then he had far better opportunities to do that in his circle, the circle he was in the 90s, than he did through becoming Russian president. He was, of course, associated, and we've talked about this before, for a long time with Anatoly Sobchak, who was the arch comprador who was in charge of St. Petersburg for quite some time, was seen as a potential rival to Yeltsin. And Putin was indeed in with those people. And he had the opportunity in the 90s to make as much money as people like Sobchak did and to cash in as much as possible. Could have helped himself to all kinds of things throughout the 1990s. Now, do I know the true extent of Putin's wealth? No, I don't. I'm not a forensic accountant with access to his bank details. But I do know that the so-called documentaries made by Navalny are garbage, and that if Putin was about making money, then again he had much easier ways to go about it than becoming president. And staying president, again, is not exactly a great way to accumulate large amounts of wealth these days, or indeed protect it. The best way, if you wanted to get rich and you're part of Putin's generation in Russia, was to go into business in the 1990s, was to loot as much of the state assets as possible, flog them off, cash in, move your money to Cyprus and then to some tax haven, then buy yourself a load of mansions in the West and buy yourself a passport of from either Germany, France, Britain, or Cyprus, which is what a lot of them did. That's the way you made money. That's the way you made serious money. And he and his children could now be living off that and writing long-winded essays for the New Statesman about how Russia's deteriorated, or doing what Mikhail Khodorkovsky does, which is run media projects whining about the state of play in Russia. So again, the idea that Putin is motivated by making large amounts of money, I just don't see it. There's much, much easier ways that a man of his experience and his generation could have done so. Now, as to the idea that he's animated by wanting to recreate the Russian Empire, again, like the historical record just doesn't bear that out. As Applebaum hints at in her answer there, for the great majority of his presidency and the time he was prime minister, Putin has been principally trying to maintain a trading relationship with the West. Principally, the consensus within the system that he operates has been to maintain a long-standing trading relationship with the Germans. That's been the enduring obsession of a particular part of the old Soviet nomenclatura and the post-Soviet Russian ruling class. A section of them thought that if they could get this trading relationship with the Germans, Russia could be integrated into Europe and they could have a long-term partnership there. Some of them saw this as a way to minimize the influence of the United States in the European Union. And of course, this turned out to be a gamble that was drastically wrong. But again, Applebaum is projecting insane nonsense onto Putin, which is saying, he wants to recreate the Tsarist Empire. Again, there's zero evidence of that. And also, if he was into that, he could have picked a lot easier targets than places like Ukraine. If he really wanted to go into the business of recreating the Tsardom, again, there's easier countries he could have targeted than ones that NATO was so heavily invested in. But what's he done? Like the Central Asian countries. But instead, the Russian government has gone about the difficult process or the more difficult process of building long-term economic partnerships and integration with the Central Asian countries, many of which were very heavily penetrated by British capital in particular. So again, if the idea was genuinely that he wanted to recreate the Tsardom, he's gone about it in a very strange way. And when he has moved, militarily speaking, when the Russian government has moved, it's been because of US and British provocations. Applebaum's not going to mention any of that. Baron Bastani is going to continue wearing his thoughtful, confused face. So, I'm going to go ahead and play a little bit more of this. Don't worry, not too much to go.
So the counter-argument with Putin is that he is a reflection of a Russian political class, which is effectively anti-liberal or has an aversion to political social liberalism. You look at the other parties in the Russian Duma. I mean, that's quite obvious. So what do you make of that argument where people say that actually Putin is an expression?
Oh, by the way, just to go back to the media point about Putin suppressing media channels, most of them were under the control of oligarchs who ended up in exile in the West, and most of them were heavily influenced by British and American intelligence. Those are the ones that got suppressed, by the way.
Of something more profound. There are people worse than him in Russian politics. It's not a defense of Putin, but there are people that are even more reactionary than he is. Whereas you would say he's the sort of, or I presume you would sort of say, he's the sort of typical archetypal autocrat dictator that we see from the 20th century, a strongman.
No, I don't think he's the 20th century strongman. I think he's different, actually. I think the 21st century is different. I think the money makes it different, the way they behave, the access they have to international finance. I think the 21st century autocrats are a little different. Again, I think I'm not sure I'm going to disagree with you. I mean, he represents a class of people who are all very wealthy and seek to maintain their power. They have convinced a large part of the Russian population to stay out of politics. So he doesn't have significant dissent in the old way that we would think of it. Although I would, remember that there is no such thing as a public square in Russia or open debate. So we don't really know what people think. People don't have political ideas that they share and so on. So that's different. And then I think at the same time, he represents his group of not all of them, but very often ex-KGB people who were young when the Soviet Union broke up, and he also has some of his own interests as well.
Right, that's a deliberately vague answer because she's no idea what the fuck she's on about. The idea that that Putin faces no challenge in Russia is a nonsense. The idea that there's no politics in Russia is a complete nonsense, because to believe that, you'd have to know absolutely nothing about contemporary Russia. Now, I won't claim that my comprehension of the Russian language is great enough to understand all of these yet, but through using translation programs, you can easily find out what the view of the opposition in Russia, i.e. the Communist Party, is of the Russian government. It's not favorable quite a lot of the time. Like, you go and read the KPRF's statements on United Russia and on the Putin presidency. They often castigate the government. They maybe tread a little bit more carefully when it comes to criticizing Putin directly, but they castigate United Russia for being pro-capitalist. They castigate Putin sometimes for saying a lot of stuff about capitalism no longer having a role to play, but never actually living up to that. They castigate people like Medvedev for being bullshit artists. They criticize various ministers very heavily, and various, not just ministers in the central government in Russia, but various governors, regional officials, and they all get very heavily criticized by the KPRF. And there are active labor struggles in Russia going on all the time. I get updated about them through mainly KPRF sources. So there are very many criticisms made of the Russian government by the main opposition party all the time. There's rows in the Russian parliament all the time. There's more substantive debates in the Russian Duma than there are in the British fucking parliament or in Congress in the United States. Like, Putin and his government might be of a progressive Bonapartist nature, but they are, again, very heavily criticized a lot. Not just online, but in person, in the Duma, in various opposition media. There's much more criticism of the Russian government, real criticism with some bite to it, than there is in the official media in the United States. The official media in the United States, I mean, someone put in the comments that it's a case of projection. Well, it really is. The activities of politicians in the United States are what Applebaum describes, which is a group of people, same in Britain, by the way, who are dedicated only to preserving their own positions and preserving their own bank accounts. That's the perfect description of the British political class, pretty much a perfect description of the American one as well. Like, whatever else you criticize Putin for, And again, there's a lot to say about him regarding genuine criticisms. Like, you cannot accuse the man of trying to lead an easy life, because the path that he's been on isn't an easy one, for all I would criticize him.
Are we partly to blame for Putin in terms of...
Absolutely, we're partly to blame.
Okay, go on.
That's one. There's a chapter in the book about how we're to blame for Putin. Yeah, no, I mean, I think the enable. It's funny. And the reason, by the way, the reason that I know how Putin came to power, and the reason that I know what our role was, our broadly meaning us Western democratic societies, is that the Russian opposition explained it to me. So they followed this.
That's the Russian opposition, by the way, which is a creation of, and is funded by, and is maintained by American and British intelligence services. Like, who was Mr. Navalny, Alexei Navalny, before his very unfortunate death, when the Russian and American governments were actually in the middle of a prisoner swap program which would have included him? So he was a bargaining chip for the Russian government. So why on earth would they kill a bargaining chip? They wouldn't. So who killed him? Interesting question. More on that later. But this opposition movement that she is describing has no or very little organic presence in Russia itself. I know we've got at least one Russian representative watching, so maybe they can clarify. But according to the research I've done, like, the Navalny element was its main opposition, its main support base was a handful of like bourgeois liberals in Moscow and St. Petersburg, and then some oligarchs exiled into London and Berlin and Paris and Washington or New York, and the intelligence services of the British and the American imperialists. That's who the Russian opposition is that she's referring to, because she's not referring to the KPRF, of course. So what she's going to do here is sort of a classic case of of an intellectual con job. She's going to say, I've spoken to this Russian opposition organization, whereas in actual fact, she, an intelligence asset of the United States, has spoken to the Russian opposition, in inverted commas, which are intelligence assets of the United States. So one US asset has spoken to another US asset, and they've agreed upon something. That's the reality.
For many years, that they would say, well, you people, you talk about human rights. Why do you let Russian oligarchs hide their money in London? Why do you let them buy property using anonymous companies and shell companies? Why have you created these tax havens that they can steal money from the Russian state and hide it there? Putin's career begins in the 90s, and this is a very famous story. It's been told by multiple people, and there's sort of 3 or 4 books about Putin that explain this. One very good one by British journalist Catherine Belton, but others by Masha Gessen and others, that describe how as early as the early 90s, Putin, in his role as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, was already involved in essentially, I mean, I'm simplifying a bit, but essentially taking money from the Russian state, taking it out of the country, laundering it abroad, keeping some of it abroad and bringing some of it back, and then using it to buy property and make investments and so on. So he was very interested in becoming rich from very early. And he was typical of a whole class of people who were doing that. And when you look at his personal history, when you look at some of the business deals that he was involved in, to the extent that we know about it, we of course don't know about everything, he very often had Western partners. There was a Luxembourg partner, there have been several German partners, there were certainly lawyers and accountants who helped him in this project, and people like him. I mean, he's part of a class. And we enabled this, essentially theft, and money laundering, and we enabled the rise of the oligarchy that became the Russian state, and now is essentially this one. It's not really a one-man show. That's the wrong way to put it. It's a hierarchy. It's a kind of spider web, and he managed to end up at the middle of it. But no, we were absolutely responsible for that, and we've been responsible for the rise of kleptocracy elsewhere as well. So I don't. It wouldn't have been possible without, Deutsche Bank and a whole series of financial institutions and enablers.
It's also recent as well. I mean, obviously you have the World Cup in Russia.
Right. Okay. I'm going to I'm going to just stop it there, because if we carry on this way, we're not going to get to the supposed title of the program. But notice how vague she is when she's talking about Putin's fortunes. Now, I will emphasize here, I don't know exactly. I'm going to remove Bastani. His face is obnoxious to me. I don't know exactly what it was that Putin got up to in the 1990s. He was an associate of Anatoly Sobchak. That is absolutely the case. He was brought into the Kremlin by the Yeltsin gang to work with them. That is true. He became head of the FSB under Yeltsin. That is also true. So he was clearly a trusted man in that respect. So he may have been involved in some very dodgy deals. In fact, if he was Sobchak's deputy, which he was, then certainly Sobchak's an incredibly dubious bastard who should be in prison. So Putin bears some responsibility there. I've never argued that this guy is clean. So, but what she doesn't specify there in her answer is she says, well, the West was responsible for Putin's rise. Notice how she doesn't really specify how. She sort of mentions vaguely that, well, he may have been involved in dodgy business deals. He may have had some deals involving Germany. He may have had some deals involving Luxembourg. She doesn't specify any of those. She doesn't talk about concrete events. So let's talk about concrete events. Let's talk about how capitalism and the comprador clique actually solidified their power in Russia, which is, I mean, we've already covered the August coup a while back, a couple of weeks back. But let's cover briefly Black October, 1993. There is a textbook case, which Applebaum is not going to talk about, of how the current constitution that governs the Russian Federation was brought about. It was brought about by, of course, the actions of Boris Nikolaevich Yeltsin in his coup against the Supreme Soviet in 1993, when a group led by his former ally and vice president, Alexander Rutskoy, was pushed via popular opposition into actually opposing Yeltsin's slash and burn program designed for him by people like Jeffrey Sachs and the IMF on behalf of American imperialism, with the specific purpose of destroying what was left of the planned economy in Russia. Now, Yeltsin sent in the tanks with the full backing of Bill Clinton. Now, Anne Applebaum is not going to talk about that, because people like her, and I think she was at the time, she was fully on board with all of this, because this was the crushing of the communist and sincere nationalist elements in Russia, who opposed Yeltsin's dismembering of the economy. And that was where the current constitution that governs Russia comes from. That the Bonapartist constitution that was instituted by Yeltsin was specifically designed in order that Yeltsin could ram through the mass privatizations of the 1990s, about which people like Anne Applebaum were delighted with. So if there is, I mean, Applebaum's talk about Western culpability, and you're not going to talk about, if you're going to talk about that, but you're not going to mention the two most glaring examples of Western interference in Russia, which is the Black October in 1993 and the Russian presidential election of 1996, where the American and British intelligence operations in favor of Yeltsin were bragged about on the front cover of Time magazine. Hollywood even made films about it a couple of years later. I think there was one starring Jeff Goldblum. So she's not going to mention that either, because if you're going to do, and this is the propaganda job the Trotskyites do. If you're going to say that Putin is the continuation of Yeltsin, then you could at least mention those examples and say that, again, the Greek Communist Party do this too, that Putin is just inheriting from Yeltsin. Well, if Putin was just inheriting from Yeltsin, though, then we would be in a different situation. But to conclude on Applebaum's false thesis, she says, well, the contemporary autocrats are different because, they got access to all this money. Again, this is untrue. I've yet to read her book, Autocrats, Inc. I mean, I will only do so if there is a massive popular demand for me to do so. I'm still trawling through the research that involves reading Liz Truss's prose, and God knows, I feel I've suffered enough doing that. But I mean, the idea that, oh, well, everything's different now from the 20th century, there was no money involved back then. Just to give an example of a Western-approved, a very famous dictator who led a lavish lifestyle at the expense of a certain American industrialist, a certain Mr. A. Hitler of Munich, a frustrated, failed Austrian watercolor artist, led a very lavish lifestyle prior to becoming chancellor, paid for by a certain Herr Tyson of German industry fame, but also a certain Mr. Henry Ford of Detroit, who was funding the Nazi Party in the 1920s and into the early 1930s. And Hitler managed to accumulate a large amount of wealth himself via the donations of certain very generous bourgeois. So, fascists, real fascists back 100 years ago, were indeed leading lavish lifestyles and accumulating fortunes thanks to the generous contributions of industrialists, landowners, and foreign interests. Now, let's go back to Putin. We've covered before how I don't think that money is, again, Putin's motivational factor. It is, presumably he has made money through the dealings he made with Sobchak 30 years ago. How much, I don't know. But again, to emphasize a point, if he was about just the cash, there's easier ways to go about things. Much easier ways. If you were in the position that he was 30 years ago, could have easily made a ton of money ripping off the Russian state, and it could have disappeared with it. So what is Putin's project? Putin's project, and this is the reason why he runs into the opposition of US imperialism and its intellectuals, led by Applebaum and others. His project was to restore functionality to the Russian state. Why is he president? Why is he chosen amongst others who had more experience? Why is it him and not Primakov, former prime minister? Well, he's chosen really because out of all the different factions that exist inside the Russian political system, the pro-Soviet faction, the pro-Eurasianist faction, the pro-Western faction, the comprador faction, of all of those, Putin is the only candidate amongst the Russian hierarchy who is the least objectionable to all of these groups. That's why he's chosen. He comes to power because he is a skilled negotiator, and he's a skilled committee man. This is his strength. And he's able to pull together a consensus amongst some very disparate groups. This is this is how he has maintained his position for many, many years. And he is probably the most skilled man at creating a consensus amongst these different groups in Russian society and in the Russian hierarchy. Now, again, something that Applebaum said, which is at least partially true, is that Putin thought that, and he's reflected on this recently himself, Putin did think that he was the Russians will be able to maintain economic relations with the West and will be slowly integrated into it. He did think that, wrongly, as he's recently reflected. The reason why he runs into trouble with the US imperialists is precisely because there are certain lines which he, either through his own beliefs or through the consensus of the governing groups in Russia and the opinions of the wider Russian population, including, of course, through the KPRF, the real opposition party, all of these views he has to take into consideration, that further subordinating the country to US imperialism was politically unacceptable to the great majority of Russians, I would say, and to key elements within the ruling group. And Putin did try to reach accommodations with the US over and over and over again, but because he had these lines over which he could not retreat, such as maintaining Russian energy independence, maintaining the Russian nuclear arsenal, maintaining Russia's strategic positions in certain areas of the world, not allowing the integrity of the Russian state to be compromised by the imperialists, not taking orders from the imperialists. Like Joe Biden went over there in 2011 and tried to order Putin not to stand again, precisely for these reasons. And the hysteria about Putin begins after around about 2002, 2003 in Britain. And the hysteria amongst the ruling class stems from the fact that essentially he started saying no to things. I mean, he went after Khodorkovsky justifiably in 2003, and again, justifiably on the basis of tax evasion and or tax fraud. And Khodorkovsky was manifestly guilty of the crime of which he was accused. But Khodorkovsky was a long-term investment of British and American intelligence. And the fact that Putin rumbled him and found out his plot to seize the presidency and essentially hand control over large segments of the Russian oil industry to the US imperialists, that plot got disrupted, and Khodorkovsky did jail time. And now he lives in exile, crying in the West with Garry Kasparov. This is one of the reasons why the propaganda campaign against Putin started, because it became clear that there were, for all his, I would argue, liberalism, there were lines beyond over which he would not retreat, and there were lines being drawn which he would not permit the imperialists to cross. This is why they turned on him. And again, they never selected him either. Like, again, he is a Russian creation. He's a creation of the relations and the contradictions inside Russian politics in the late 1990s. The Trotskyite claim that the West selected him is unproven nonsense. In fact, I'll go as far as to say I think it's propaganda. It's made up. So, but Applebaum goes on norovirus media, sprays shit everywhere, and everybody needs to bear in mind that when you're watching a channel that's nominally left, which has never actually been subject to suppression, it's because the ruling class want you to hear them and want you to think that they're an alternative. They're not. And I'm glad they had Applebaum on there, or Mrs. Radek-Sikorsky, as she should be more properly known, because the fact that Bastani gave her a completely uncritical audience, or I should say a completely uncritical interview, where they all agreed that Putin's a jolly nasty, illiberal chap, and Bastani revealed himself as having the political understanding of the depth of a puddle. Well, I'm glad he did all of those things, because if you're still subscribing to that channel, I have to ask you, why? Why? Don't even have to particularly like the content that I put out, but for God's sake, stop giving these people money. Spend it on a pizza. Spend it on some crack cocaine. Something better for you than this. Right. Okay. So, moving on then to more interesting, perhaps, topics, which is, of course, the fact that it is 23 years now since the events of September the 11th, 2001. Joe Biden has recently confirmed that he did 9/11. Look it up. He said it. And he's going to do it again today. So we await developments on that. But more seriously, 23 years ago, I was a relatively fresh-faced 19-year-old. And believe it or not, I was a business studies student in college near my hometown. And we heard in the mid-afternoon that a small plane had hit the Empire State Building, and we ignored it. I went and did my shift at my evening job, went home and found out that it was actually, and this is here the official story begins, 3 airliners had hit the 2 towers of the World Trade Center and had hit the Pentagon in the United States. A 4th plane had been shot down, United 93 it's called, over Pennsylvania. I'm giving the game away there, had been taken back over by its passengers and had been forced down into a crash landing following a fight with the terrorists. So, this, of course, launched a rampage by American imperialism through Afghanistan, through Iraq, Libya, Syria, and many, many other places across the West Asia, Central Asia, and other parts of the world. Provided the justification for the kind of rampage that the US imperialists had been looking to do for many years, that they'd been planning for the decade beforehand. And what it ended up with was a disaster for many millions of people who were killed, the over 30 million who were internally or externally displaced. It created a blood-soaked hellhole in many parts of the world. So this was the beginning 23 years ago of all of this. And so it is upon us to ask the question as to, well, what did really happen that day? Now, I will be open about the fact that I didn't seriously consider alternative, or should we say, more likely explanations for what went on then for many years. I just didn't consider it to be important. But the more you examine the events of September the 11th, the more unclear it becomes as to what actually went on. Just as you have to do many years of reading and many hours, put in many hours of researching and understanding the way that the American state works to understand even an event like Watergate, with its hidden networks and hidden agendas and state actors trying to overthrow a president. Again, like the story of, to just use this for a moment, the story of Watergate, which is presented to you cartoonishly via the movie done by Robert Redford, All the President's Men, as heroic journalists take down crooked president, whereas in actual fact the reality is crooked, murderous bastard of a president taken down by even more crooked and even more murderous intelligence apparatus because they had some tactical disagreements. Looks a lot less heroic when you put it that way. Story of 9/11 2001, though, because it kicks off and is used as a justification for so many imperialist wars and so much bloodletting and so much slaughter. Ultimately, though, the slaughter is futile. They were unable to establish the new American century. Their plan fell to pieces in the Middle East. The resistance of Afghans and Iraqis and now Syrians proved too much. The American imperialist system proved too weak and too feeble to actually sustain another century of the American empire. The decay of American imperialism is too great. But it does, again, it does behoove us to ask what did happen on the day that was used for so long to justify all these crimes. Now, the official story is that 19 men who were mainly of Saudi and Egyptian nationality, though with some other nationalities in there, hijacked 4 planes and flew them into 2 of the World Trade Center towers and into the Pentagon. The other plane that was, again, according to the official story, forced down by its passengers, taking it back over from the hijackers, was either, depending upon which story you believe, meant to hit the White House or meant to hit the Pentagon, meant to hit the halls of Congress. Now, almost immediately, stories were coming out, or questions were being raised as to what exactly was going on, because aside from the collapse of the 2 World Trade Center towers, you have the collapse of the 3rd tower that day, the much smaller World Trade Center building number 7, which, again, go and watch the footage. It's all available extensively all over YouTube. You can see what is quite clearly a controlled demolition. Again, go and compare it to other controlled demolitions. Go and listen to the accounts of, I think they're called architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. They raise a lot of very interesting points, certainly about building number 7. Building number 7 was reportedly where a lot of intelligence organizations had their bases, where the New York City mayor's emergency center was. So because it was on fire, Giuliani, now a drunken joke, back then a slightly more serious figure, was meant to have his emergency center. He couldn't get access to it. But it was meant to collapse because of the damage done by a series of office fires, which again has happened at no other place in the world involving a building that's meant to be that secure and that stably constructed. There are claims, again, made by numerous people, that the actual collapse of the 2 World Trade Center towers themselves was not due to aviation fuel weakening the structures of the buildings in its burning, to the point where those buildings collapsed. There are claims which I think should at least be read and questioned seriously, or taken seriously, that in actual fact what happened was, again, controlled demolitions on those buildings. I've read some accounts which claim that there was an intelligence operation done, or a military intelligence operation done to rig up a gigantic amount of demolition charges on those buildings across the summer of 2001. And when the planes flew in, that was the trigger for detonating these explosives. Again, I'm not a structural engineer. There are people who make these claims which are, but there are a number of inconsistencies in the official explanation with regard to all of the World Trade Center buildings, the two main ones and Tower 7. There are inconsistencies in the things that just make no sense. For instance, why is so much of the official investigation of the means by which those towers come down, why is so much of that classified? Why is the means by which, like the various government bodies are said to have proved the way the tower collapsed, why are they all classified or the records destroyed? Why is it the case that the building burnt so long after it had collapsed? Why were there like rivers of molten metal running through the ruins? Again, like, these are questions to which I don't know a firm answer, but what I do know is that the official explanation merits a great deal of questioning. Why is it that they claim to be able to identify Mohammed Atta, one of the alleged attackers, by finding his passport in the ruins of the World Trade Center? Even the announcer who put that on the news 23 years ago found that hard to believe. Like, why on earth are they claiming that they found a hijacker's passport in the ruins of the building when it would have had to have survived the initial impact of the plane into the building, followed by the fire, followed by the building's collapse? Again, doesn't make any sense. Why is it that the official explanation given by George W. Bush, that the reason for the successful attack on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon was a failure of imagination by the intelligence services? Why then, if the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and numerous other intelligence services in the United States completely and utterly failed to detect the largest attack on the American mainland in many, many years? In fact, I think it's the largest attack on the mainland USA, not including Pearl Harbor, for over a century. Why on earth did nobody resign? Why did nobody lose their job? Why did nobody from this hierarchy of the FBI, the CIA, or the NSA ever face any disciplinary action or feel obliged to resign? Why? It doesn't matter. I mean, if you are looking at this from the perspective of bourgeois politics, there is always, in bourgeois politics, when something goes wrong, normally, a rush to find a scapegoat and a rush to find somebody to pin it all on. If you can't, especially if something's gone as catastrophically wrong as leading to over 2,000 Americans dying on one day. Yet nobody in the hierarchy of the intelligence services or the military was ever held accountable. Why is it that on the very day of the hijacking, the American Air Force officers who were dealing with monitoring the skies were thrown into confusion by the fact that they were performing an exercise which mirrored exactly the very events that were taking place? I believe it's Operation. The operation was designed to simulate the hijacking of planes and the flying of them into buildings. Even in very mainstream reports, very done by the bourgeois press, radar operators for the US Air Force were stating that they were confused by the TV pictures coming in because they didn't know whether it was part of the training exercise or not. Is it not the most gigantic of coincidences that on the very same day that the US Air Force is conducting a training exercise about terrorists hijacking aircraft and flying them into buildings, that terrorists just happen to hijack some aircraft and fly them into buildings? Why is it that at least two, possibly more of the hijackers were known to Saudi intelligence and were receiving payments from the Saudi government during their time in the US in the very early 2000s? Again, this is something that even the official 9/11 inquiry had to concede. So the very fact that several of these men came from Saudi Arabia, that some of them were receiving payments from the Saudi government to pay for their stay in the United States. The fact that this was covered up for over a decade by the U.S. government does raise the question as to who were they really? Who were they really working for? What were they really doing? If they were getting paid by the Saudi government, why? Why were they getting paid by the Saudi government? Saudi government admittedly spends a lot of money on various different things, but they wouldn't. Why were they giving money to so bunch of random Saudis who, it turns out, if you believe the official story, were plotting to carry out the deadliest terrorist attack in American history, other than that done by a certain Mr. Timothy McVeigh, of course. Why? Why did the U.S. government cover that up? Why was the official 9/11 investigation not allowed to question the president or the vice president under oath? Why is it that Bush and Cheney had to appear together? Was it that Cheney was making sure that Bush didn't say anything that he shouldn't do? Hey, again, like questions that remain unanswered. Again, like why was it that nobody from the intelligence services ever reflected seriously upon the things that had gone wrong? Why was the only person that resigned out of the anti-terrorism apparatus Richard Clarke, who was a bit of a dubious figure anyway? Why is it that within hours the American government confidently announced that this was the work done by Osama bin Laden? What evidence was there that it was ever presented, except that which was obtained via waterboarding, which is torture, that bin Laden was actually the one who was the mastermind? Given that they arrested a guy called Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was apparently the guy that designed it, what role did Osama bin Laden actually play in the planning, execution, or funding of this attack? Again, these are questions which I would love to have the answer to, but we can't because bin Laden was killed. He was killed in a very dubious operation, which involved him being sold out via somebody who was a walk-in to an American embassy, I think, who essentially said, "Oh, bin Laden's living in his place in Pakistan. You should go and kill him. Can I have $1 million, please?" That he had apparently, a man with severe kidney problems, had survived the mountains of Afghanistan, had escaped the American invasion, and now was living with the full knowledge of the Pakistani authorities in Abbottabad in Pakistan. Why is it that he was living there for years undisturbed? Was it that the Pakistanis were hiding him? Well, that's possible. It's eminently possible, given that we know from just any amount of serious research into the Pakistani state that there are multiple different factions within that state, as there are within any state, to be honest. There are those who are pro-American. There are those who are anti-American. But are we seriously saying that the US didn't know he was there? I think they did. I think that they chose to eliminate him in the end. Again, there are various motives in play here. Politically speaking, the Obama people decided they needed a big play for the 2012 election. So let's bring bin Laden out of the cupboard and have him supposedly killed. We're not going to even keep his body. We're going to dispose of it by throwing it into the sea. So given that they could easily have got hold of bin Laden, given that the Bush administration also turned down a Taliban offer in 2001 to hand over bin Laden to a third-party Muslim country where he could be put on trial. Now, they could have easily have taken them up on that offer if they wanted to put him on trial and have secured his extradition from that third-party country. So if you wanted to actually put the man you're insisting was the leader of the deadly and dangerous Al-Qaeda network who carried out this deadly terrorist attack in the mainland USA, why would you not want to take the Taliban up on their offer, given that the Bush administration already had extensive dealings with the Taliban? Now, you clearly aren't squeamish about who they deal with. Why not take them up on their offer and extradite him and put him on trial? Or put him on trial in front of an international tribunal? Or bring him to the United States and put him on trial in New York City? Why not do that? Well, it's too dangerous. Bullshit. You know? Why spend so much time and so much energy grabbing up a bunch of guys from Afghanistan and other places and holding them in Guantanamo Bay and torturing them endlessly, despite the fact that many of them could have known absolutely nothing about the events of 9/11 itself or anything that subsequently happened, given that the Northern Alliance was effectively selling these people to them for a price? Why have this torture camp at the end of Cuba established there? It's been established there for over 100 years, but why have this torture camp established there, where you run this prison regime, where you normalize the application of torture techniques? Why have that? Why have that set up straight away? Why maintain it for 23 years? Why do you still have people there now, despite the fact that they've released some of them? Why maintain a series of bases, black sites across the world after 9/11, where you flew unnamed people into, tortured them, often using the services of other regimes so that you could maintain plausible deniability? And what are you doing with these people? What questions are you asking them? Why do you want to fly them into black sites and have them tortured? What are you aiming to get out of this? All questions that remain unanswered, of course. Now, let's go back to the big one. Why not grab bin Laden when the Taliban offered him? Why not put him on trial in the United States or a third-party country? The answer is that if you put bin Laden on trial, not only, and this is the most obvious point to make, does he know an awful, or did he know, let's just assume that he's dead for the purposes of argument, he knew an awful lot about the Saudi royal family, about, well, his own family's integration within the Saudi elite, about that the Saudis' involvement in the Afghan war, about the Saudis' involvement with the CIA, about his own involvement with the CIA. So all of that stuff could conceivably come out the moment you put him on trial. So there is the embarrassment angle. He knew an awful lot about American operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere. And of course, he'd remained a free man for over a decade after the end of the Afghan war, despite the fact that he was credited with terrorist attacks against American interests. Remember the bombings in, I believe it was Kenya and Tanzania, the bombing of the USS Cole, all of which were blamed on him. So again, why not try and get hold of him? Why not try and have him extradited? They knew where he was. They had relations with the Taliban. You know, why is it that Bill Clinton never seriously tried to have him extradited, given that the Clinton administration blamed the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania on the bin Laden network, on Al Qaeda? Why not, when he's hiding out in Sudan, rather than bombing Sudan to cover up a sex scandal, why not try and get him extradited from Sudan? Are we saying that that's beyond the reach of American imperialism with all of the power that it has at its disposal? Again, there are so many things about the story of the latter part of Osama bin Laden's life which make absolutely no sense. Now, there's various different explanations as to why he remained a free man until 9/11, and immediately afterwards, of course, which is that there are various different operations being run by various different American intelligence services that swirl around bin Laden and his supposed network. And they wanted to maintain these networks in place and these agents in place, and that scooping up bin Laden and trying to put him on trial would have jeopardized other intelligence operations that the US was running at the time. By the way, that's a fairly similar explanation as to the reasons why the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 ultimately happened. That they had many intelligence operatives and informants operating across these militia networks, and that if they'd have actually prevented the bombing, it would have involved wrapping up or arresting a lot of people who were either double agents or direct agents of the US state, and that they didn't want to do that. Now, that's the most conventional explanation. With regard to the Oklahoma City bombing, there's similar explanations that are advanced for the events of September the 11th in 2001. Again, we don't know. Certainly there are similarities in the way that the investigation into Oklahoma City was handled, and that it was pinned pretty quickly on two guys, principally one guy, and that guy had an incredibly dubious history involving large elements of the American state in his rather checkered past. Same with bin Laden. And the concluding point that I will make here is that the whole creation of Al Qaeda is a work of fiction. Much like the title of a book I've just opened up recently, which is by a Mexican author, a Mexican researcher, about the fact that the cartels, entitled "The Cartels Do Not Exist." I'll go you one further. Al Qaeda does not exist. Not as the entity it was portrayed as. Not as this global spanning terror operation with bin Laden at the center of the spider's web directing operations. That never existed. That was always a fiction. There are, of course, a series of franchise operations that have taken up the name of Al-Qaeda at various different points. There are various different incarnations of it, such as al-Nusra, that have operated. But an awful lot of these, I will say with some confidence because there's been reporting done on this, so many of these different franchise operations can be traced back to a relationship with a US or British intelligence service or individuals directly connected to the US and British intelligence services. Then you have to ask the question of what kind of existence these things would have without these intelligence operatives. We know very well that they were involved in getting what is called Al-Qaeda into Bosnia in the mid-1990s, into Kosovo in as late as 1999, and again getting Al-Qaeda people into Syria and Libya later on. We also know that the man known as Zarqawi, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, supposedly the head of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, had spent years in Iraqi Kurdistan when it was essentially an American protectorate. And that's where he came down into central Iraq from, where he promptly started a sectarian war directed against the Shia population, again, largely operating in the interests of the United States. So let's not look at the radical pronunciations accredited to people like Zarqawi. Let's look instead at what they did, which is that Zarqawi's life in Iraq and his operations actually served US imperialism far more than he ever damaged them. That's the actual reality of his existence and of his operations there. Same is true for most of these people who are credited as being representatives of Al-Qaeda. So many of them are linked to American intelligence that it's hard to tell where one begins and the other ends. So given that we can establish that Al-Qaeda, as it has been presented in the bourgeois press, is a fiction, that what is credited as being Al-Qaeda and individuals who are credited as being Al-Qaeda have either close or very, shall we say, approximate links to US and British intelligence, then what was the bin Laden network? Did it ever really exist? What was the role of the US in building it up in the first place? I think the answer we can provide via things we can prove, such as the fact that this operation or things related to it pop up in areas where the US needs a mercenary force, both before and after 2001, we can say pretty much definitively that this is an operation which would not exist without the US intelligence services. So make of that what you will. Again, I don't know the exact truth of what happened on September the 11th. I know that there are an awful lot of inconsistencies with the official story. There is, of course, to conclude on this point, the fact that the man who is alleged to have flown the plane into the Pentagon couldn't even handle, or barely could handle, a single-engine Cessna, and yet pulls off a maneuver that most of the highly skilled combat pilots in the world couldn't do in a large civilian airliner, to hit an exact point on the Pentagon wall, flying it less than 80 feet above the ground. Again, the large parts of this story just simply don't make any sense. What is certain is that there was planes flown into those buildings. Large number of people died. Until finally, with United 93, when you get a British intelligence asset, which is what Paul Greengrass, I think, is, to make a story dramatizing the takeover of this flight by the passengers, and yet when you examine the wreckage of it, you can see that it clearly, to me and my inexpert eye, doesn't look like something which crashed into the dirt. It looks like something that broke up in midair and then the remains of the plane landed on the dirt. You can see that what's actually been done is a shooting down operation by the Air Force, which was then covered up and declared to be a great and heroic story and immortalized in the Hollywood movie. So many fictions, so little time, but I will pause there for a certain number of questions. Yes, I will be doing more reading on this for those of you who are asking questions. Yes, there is a documentary called The the new Pearl Harbor. I did watch it many years ago. I probably need to go back over it again. But certainly it was the case that that the various representatives of the Project for the New American Century were calling for a new Pearl Harbor all the way through the 1990s, and then they got one. So again, whatever way you want to take this, there's some very dubious stuff there, and I haven't even got to all the insider trading that was done immediately before, and like in the days running up to September the 11th, 2001, the money that was made off insurance by the new owner of the World Trade Center towers, Larry Silverstein, who, by the way, was a friend of Donald Trump. But there's enough circumstantial evidence there in the insider trading to show that somebody, whoever that was, knew very well that something big was coming, and it was likely to have a certain impact on certain stocks, certain airline stocks in particular, and so placed their bets accordingly. Now, the Securities and Exchange Commission apparently did conduct an investigation, but the results of that have never been made public. And according to some people, I haven't checked this out myself, though, that the records of those investigations were destroyed. So why? I think that if you put all of these questions and the answers that we have together, the minimum, and I do mean the minimum, you could say, is as follows: that the entity known as Al-Qaeda is, in the way it has been presented, a work of fiction. There are men who are various forms of Salafist who have been organized together in groups who have carried out operations that are accredited to Al-Qaeda. These men often, in fact more often than not, have worked with US intelligence. The US intelligence services had informers all over these various networks and direct agents. They knew that the World Trade Center was at risk from the earlier attempt made in 1993. They had eyes on what was supposedly Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's preparatory meeting in, I think it was Kuala Lumpur, before the bombing. They knew very well that there was the possibility of using aircraft as essentially missiles to attack civilian targets. And again, this had been flagged as a risk. And even if we just go off the more conventional narrative outlined by like Richard Clarke, we knew that the Bush administration was warned over and over again that this was coming. And somebody knew it was coming because somebody was making the exact right bets to make a lot of money off it in the days leading up to it. So they knew that something was going to happen. They knew that somebody knew it was going to affect airline stocks. Larry Silverstein knew to take out some bloody big insurance on the World Trade Center. So within the closed and relatively small circles of the American ruling class, people knew that something was up, and yet nothing was done to stop it. And even after over 2,000 Americans died, and this was blamed on a failure of imagination of the intelligence services, nobody loses their job. Why? The question of that, I think, can be answered with a degree of certainty. Nobody loses their job after 9/11 because if somebody if, say, they tried to pin it on George Tenet of the CIA or some of the FBI hierarchy or the NSA, if they said it was their fault, or it's somebody in the political hierarchy's fault, then that's a loose string that can be pulled at. Because if you try and pin it on somebody, then there's every chance that they start talking themselves, or they go to their friends in the press, or they leak information to sympathetic members of Congress. In my view, whatever happened on September the 11th, 2001, and I venture no certain theory of my own here, but whatever did happen isn't what the official investigation said happened. That there is an awful lot that has been simply covered up and not talked about at all, and that the various heads of intelligence services and their deputies knew that something was up. And if any of those people got fired or got blamed for this, then there's every chance they start talking and trying to deflect the blame elsewhere. So the only way that you get away with covering up whatever it was that actually went on that day, the only way you maintain strict operational security is if everybody who was involved in whatever cover-up went on gets away, and that everybody who is involved in that has an absolute vested political interest or financial interest, or an interest in staying out of prison, in keeping the story exactly as it is. You start pulling at those threads by firing people or blaming people for it, then some of those people might decide that they're not going to go down without a fight, and then your whole story falls apart. The reason why nobody was fired, the reason why nobody was ever held responsible, is because that's how you maintain a degree of operational security, by making sure that everybody has a vested interest in staying silent, and that everybody has a vested interest in everybody else staying silent as well. Right, okay. I will be drawing things to a close on this one for today. Thanks to all 294 of you who are watching. We've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes or so. So I think what I'll do is I may, if anybody's interested in continuing this conversation, I may pick this up in a Rumble only stream tomorrow. If anybody's interested in that. It seems like I've probably missed loads of questions and points in this chat that I can't pick up on at the moment. So what I'll do is I'll do a Rumble stream tomorrow at a certain point. Keep an eye out for that. And then we'll be back with the usual business in the evening. But until then, thanks to everybody who's tuned in. Thanks to everybody who's contributed to the chat. I'm sorry I couldn't get through enough comments tonight. There's an awful lot to get through. Again, I will be appointing some moderators pretty soon. So again, anybody interested in that, be sure to email me. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and on Buy Me a Coffee. Patreon show coming up later this week. We'll be looking at Tucker Carlson's new favorite historian and Should You Question World War II. Be sure to tune in for that one. See you again tomorrow.